Today is Monday and we are doing vocabulary, and we only have 2 words today. I'm showing you the overall page here to remind you where we left off last week. We've got 2 words that we're going to fill in today, just adaptation and pollination, but they have really long definitions, so that's why we're only doing 2 words today. And we're going to get started with adaptation. So an adaptation is a genetic change. Remember, we know genetic means in the DNA. So adaptation is a genetic change in DNA, a genetic change in DNA that results in a structural or behavioral change in an organism, and this change helps it survive in its environment. So an adaptation is a genetic change that results in a structural or behavioral change in an organism that helps it survive in its environment. I also realized I need a little comma there to separate off that phrase. So it's something that helps an organism survive in its environment, and it is a genetic change. So what we're going to put in the details box, and this is very important, adaptations are things organisms are born with. It's not something that they grow an extra arm because they need it, or they suddenly develop the ability to change the color of their fur. This is something that they are born with. So these are changes that organisms are born with. Right? Adaptations are things organisms have from the time that they're born, and they can then be passed to their children. So changes that organisms are born with, they pass from parent to offspring. So if the mommy and the daddy giraffe have really long necks, well, then their baby will also have a really long neck. So changes an organism are born with, and they pass from parent to offspring. And then in the example box here, I'm going to write a couple of examples of adaptations that organisms have. So an adaptation that we see in many types of plants is we can see spines or thorns on a cactus, right? That's definitely an adaptation that a cactus has in relation to their dry environment. Another example of an adaptation would be horns or antlers on deer, right? So horns or antlers on deer or different kinds of sheep or goats, right? Those are definitely adaptations that help them survive in their environment. And I'm just going to do another plant example, especially because we're going to be talking about plants this week. Pine needles, right? The fact that trees have needles instead of leaves, pine needles on pine trees, right? That is definitely an adaptation that helps them to survive in an environment that can get very cold and also have snow. So again, those are just 3 examples. And those are things the organism is born with, right? They're born with the horns, they're born with the needles, they're born with the spines, and they are a result of a genetic change in their DNA. And then the next word is our focus for this week. This week we're really going to focus in on plants. And one of the things that we're going to focus that plants do is they do a process called pollination. Pollination is the process. Pollination is the process of transferring. The process of transferring pollen grains, which are actually sperm. So pollination is the process of transferring pollen grains from the male anther, that's a part of a flower, which we'll learn about. So the process of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma. And again, anther and stigma are just parts of a flower that we're going to be learning about this week. So pollination is the process of transferring pollen grains from the male anther of a flower to the female stigma. And this process is obviously what creates new plants or creates seeds. So I'm going to write two things here. I'm going to write creates new plants, but they're not actually plants at first, right? They start as seeds. So this process creates new plants or seeds, and it also happens by two processes. So it happens by wind or animals. So pollination can happen because of the wind blowing, or pollination can also happen because animals might do the transferring of pollen grains. So what I'm going to draw from my picture is what most people think of when they think of pollination and when they think of the animal that does a lot of this movement. And the animal I'm talking about is a bumblebee. We're probably all familiar with seeing bees flying around from flower to flower, and what they are doing is a process called pollination. So I'm going to draw very super large here, right? These are gigantic flowers by comparison, right? So here are some flowers. So the male part of the flower, which is called the anthers, they have these kind of structures with these little like dots on them. So the bumblebee is going to go from the anthers. I'm going to draw my little bumblebee here. Again, this is not an image that's to scale. So here's my happy little bumblebee, and the bumblebee is going to come over to another flower, and then there's this big kind of skinny part that's in the flower called the stigma. So the bumblebee is going to move pollen from one flower to another, and that process of moving pollen from what's called the anther to the stigma, that is the process of pollination. So that process of moving pollen is really important because that's what's going to allow plants to create new versions of themselves and seeds. It's going to allow them to reproduce. So as you can see this week with our two vocabulary words, we're starting to get into the other characteristics of living things, right? Living things respond to their environment. Another good word for that is adapt, and living things reproduce, right? They make more of themselves. So I'm going to go ahead and leave up adaptation and pollination. I'm going to call on some people to answer, and then we're going to have some work time for our cell analogy project.